questions, I'm really delighted to introduce Dawson Rohl. Dawson is the CEO of Child Australia. I first met Dawson in Canberra a very 2007, long time ago, when he was CEO of Mary Mead, a family support service. Dawson is one of the movers and shakers in Western Australia and has a very big passion for inclusion and social inclusion in particular. And what we've asked Dawson to do is talk a bit about what's happening in WA, and then that will be followed up by Brett New, our Executive Principal, talking about Doveton and where we're up to. Jane will facilitate some further conversation and discussion. And I also just wanted to say that all of the presentations that we've had this week and our slides and things like that will all be eventually put on our website. So you'll actually be able to sit with staff and other people to have a look at them. There's a lot of teachers and people can't get here today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Dawson and welcome and thank you, Dawson.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Good afternoon. I'd just like to thank June. I was thinking of Dawn. June and Brett for inviting me to speak here today. I'm from Western Australia, as June said, and I'm the outsider here today, but I usually am the outsider in some way or another. And I don't know about shaking and moving. I shake, don't always get things moving, but I do a lot of shaking anyway. I'm going to talk about integration, and I'm going to talk about social change and complex social systems, and a range of things, but my own journey in that regard and what we're doing in WA as well. So it's going to be a bit of an eclectic sort of discussion and presentation today. First, though, I'd like to just say something about Child Australia and give you some ideas. I'm just going to move to just a quote that I found recently and I really like a lot. The true purpose of life is to plant trees whose shade you do not expect to sit under. And I think that goes for Child Australia and what we're doing, and I'm sure all the work that you're doing as well. Child Australia is based in, our home base is in Western Australia, but we got services in Northern Territory. And we've got a whole range of services. And our history, until about 4 years ago, we were called the Resource Unit for Children with Special Needs. With a name like that, you can understand why we want to change it as well. But it did signify our early beginnings 27 years ago, which was all around social inclusion. The organization was started to ensure that children, regardless of whatever special needs there were included within the early learning settings. So that was our beginning. But by the time I got there, I've been there about 6 years now. By the time I arrived, really we had spread out our brief. Our mission had really evolved into beyond just inclusion, but to including the whole child, the family, and the community. So, and advocacy was a big component of what we were doing as well. So it made more sense to actually consider changing the name, and that's when, about 4.5 years ago, we changed it to Child Australia. We have a range of services. What was mentioned earlier was by Fran was the Professional Support Coordinator Program, or the Inclusion and Professional Support Program. We've got 2 fairly large contracts from the federal government to provide professional development and support to in WA and the Northern Territory. We've got their PSCs, as they're for short. But we also have inclusion support as well. So we got 6 of the 8 inclusion support agencies in WA. So we're doing both and doing quite a lot of it. WA is pretty unique. We always like to consider ourselves special. But it is 1/3 of the continent. It's a massive amount of territory to provide services to. We're involved up in the Pilbara, in every region of the state. But when you're looking at the Pilbara and the Kimberley, and trying to be able to provide inclusion, professional development, and family services in those areas, there's all kinds of challenges. Just recruiting staff and keeping staff, for example, is just enormous. We have 2 early learning centers, one in a low SES area in Perth called Lockridge, and another one in the Northern Territory called Farah. And the Northern Territory is growing and expanding. It's one of the fastest growing and wealthiest, if you're so lucky, areas of the country. But we're working on an Aboriginal community called Bagot. It's right in the middle of Darwin. And we've got an out-of-school care service. We've got family support, family transitioning, and there's about 400 Aboriginal people on this community. It's a really interesting place to be, and we're enjoying it because it's some of our first work specifically with Aboriginals, and there's a lot of potential there for us to do something, and we're beginning to see results already in terms of just getting children into schools. We also have, I suppose quality, inclusion, and capacity building would be the three big briefs that we've got. So just briefly, we have a conference, an Early Childhood Education and Care Conference every 2 years. And I really started that back in 2007 when I met June. And I met Jane Bertrand at the same time. And I haven't said this to them individually, but these two women really had a big impact on me, really inspired me. I've been working in the I guess, collective impact, integrated service delivery. That was in my mindset for many years in other sectors that I worked in. But it was the early years that both Jane and June influenced me on. And in 2007 at Canberra, we had a conference. And then I moved back to Perth and continued having conferences. Jane came back in 2009. Her colleague, who some of you may have heard of, Stuart Shanker, has come back several times. So in terms of capacity building, that conference provides a platform to bring in international experts and a chance for conversations to occur. And that conference wasn't occurring because child care workers on this side and teachers on this side, they did their own thing. We just didn't bridge the gap. So the conference, one of the main goals of the conference is to bridge that gap, and that's slowly getting there. So that's just one of the capacity building, but advocacy on a big scale. We just had we formed a partnership with WACOS, the WA cause, on a couple of things. One was collective impact, which I'm going to just talk about briefly, and the other one was to bring Stuart Shanker back over again. Stuart Shanker being one of the movers around self-regulation. And he's made a big impact on Western Australia, which is what the conference and all the work that we're doing, that's what its intention is to make an impact. So we don't want people to come flying in, do their thing, and fly out. It's to stay a while. So that, in a nutshell, is what Child Australia is. And I just talk about, I've been here for several days looking at Doveton. I've been watching and listening to Doveton as it's evolved over the last 2 or 3 years. I'm talking to June. And also watching Toronto First Duty. In fact, Toronto First Duty was one of the first places I wanted to go see on a study tour back in 2007. And both projects, which have influenced each other, as they have said today, have really influenced the whole sector in this area. Good evidence-based, high-quality, integrated service delivery platforms that can, provide the means of multiple services coming together. It's second to none, and they're doing fantastic work. So I've had an opportunity for the first time to actually see Doveton physically, and it's been fantastic. And it relates to what I want to talk about today, which is, I guess, how do you deal with complex social problems? What kind of language are we using? We're dealing with systems, and you're all dealing, I'm sure, with multiple systems all the time. Whether you're in an organization doing one role, you're interacting with and developing relationships and working with them all the time. So my focus is going to be on social complexity. Analyzing, how do you analyze social complex situations? And the kind of language, we're still using the language of linear cause and effect in some ways. The language of individualism, rather than the fact that we're systems. And we're talking about systems, and that requires a different kind of language. I'll give you an example. My first life, I was a psychotherapist, counselor. So counseling, it's about change, no less than what you're doing, but it's change in a different sort of way. But it's helping people get from point A to point B. They've got particular problems. So my early years, starting in the 70s, as a therapist, I was looking at the individual child. I was focusing on that child and their behavior, and behaviorism reigned king at the time in terms of whether it was Freudian or Jungian therapists. It was all about the individual psychology and or dysfunction of children or individuals. What I was really interested in, though, was family therapy, and that's what I did for many years, was family therapy. When you're looking at a family and you're looking at a child's behavior that, let's say, was referred to me, and you're looking at the behavior of the child when you sit down, work with a child individually, as opposed to when you make sense of that child's behavior within the context of a family, you need a different language. You need a different way of describing what's going on, because it's now in a system. And so instead of, I began to sort of think about, and I had to actually find a different language, and that language was the language of systems, network theory, cybernetics, game and group theory. These were all the new theories that came out of the quantum sciences in the last 70 years or so, because 70, 80, 90 years ago, we were told, we haven't caught up with it yet, we were told that we aren't individuals. We actually constantly interact with and are co-created within the context of family, community, systems beyond that. That was what we were told, but we still act as though we were individuals. So as a family therapist, I had to learn that new lexicon, that new language, to be able to understand the family as a system. And a family is really just a group with a history. And so I had to sort of make a change there. Just want you to have a look at, got a bird in the room. Got a bird in the room. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. Have you ever come across the phenomenon in nature called flocking? It's a really interesting phenomenon. The same thing happens with schools of fish. But in flocking, what you've got is, you've seen it all, birds that all are thousands of birds all moving at the same time, and somehow they're able to communicate this. They're able to move together on a dime or 5 centimes. But they're moving together. And there's 3 rules that they looked at when scientists looked at the rules for this, of how they do it. 1, you all go the same speed. 2, you keep a minimum distance between you and the people, the person, the bird next to you. And 3, you all move to the center. And I just thought that was a really interesting way of describing integrated service delivery and collective action as well. There's another interesting phenomenon that goes with this as well, which is the leader that's up front. At some point, that leader gets tired. So they go to the back of the flock, and someone else takes their place. But at the back, you get this lift, this air drift, so that all those that are in the back get pulled along by the rest of the birds. So they get that little bit of extra effort. And I thought that was just an additional interesting phenomena related to flocking. But I thought that it made a lot of sense in terms of what we're trying to do here. If you want to go fast, you go alone. But if you want to get far, then you go together. What I want to talk about just is no, that's not where I want to be at. I want to be here. Just something about WA and what we're doing in terms of the work that you've been hearing about today. So, WA Child and Parent Centers. And this was something that my organization was involved in advocating for several years. And amazingly, it did come to fruition. It wasn't perfect. It isn't a perfect model, but it certainly was more than I expected to happen in Western Australia. So what happened, and I spent about a year with a group with the Premier and Cabinet actually having input into what is definitions, for instance, that Fran talked about. We looked at what are definitions of integrated service delivery. We looked at models and theories all over the world and had input into Premier and Cabinet. And that then informed a new policy shift by the West Australian government, which was a conservative government. The Liberal got in by then. And what occurred was they funded, in the beginning, 10 school-based child and parent centers, child and center parents on public school sites in low socioeconomic communities. Those were the first 10. It was the purpose, one-stop shop, center often purpose-built with a comprehensive range of core facilities. These are the three, sorry, I'm going to go to all three of these. These were three models that they looked at: one-stop, hub and spoke, and virtual integration. And they, just keep going here. The purpose was to close the gap between development, health, and learning outcomes of young children, particularly those at risk and not achieving their potential. What they wanted to do was they tendered for a coordinator, which was an NGO, to actually coordinate each one of those. And the money for it was like $350,000 a year for the coordinator. They put a purpose-built, not a very big infrastructure, but a purpose-built infrastructure that might house child health nurse, a speechy. They might be able to have play groups in it, but it was a small, very prescribed kind of space. They've loosened up a little bit in terms of what that's going to look like, but the $350,000 was separate from the infrastructure, and the 10 schools were identified in low socioeconomic income areas. I was just thinking of what Ted was saying earlier about having it on the edge of low socioeconomic income areas. But our populations are still fairly diverse, as June was saying as well, and Jane, I think it was talking about, it's about the diversity of the families as well. But their idea was they wanted to make, want to have an impact on that particular demographic. That got started, and just before the last election, they made a decision to fund 6 more of them. So we now got 16 school sites in WA, and it's also still very early days. But at least they made a go of this. One of the things that unfortunately is missing with this model, and what you have at Doveton, and also what you have at Toronto First Duty, is that, and we argued strenuously not to leave this out, that it was absolutely critical for an initiative like this, was to have a universal service, that is an early learning center, on the school site. And they didn't go with that. Now the idea from their perspective is that you're going to be working with the other schools and services in the area, and it's really community development and engaging and developing a hub and spoke sort of idea. But I think personally, I think they missed an opportunity there, but that just wasn't going to happen. It may happen in the future, but I think that was an opportunity lost. But at least they've got the foundation, and maybe in a few years from now, they can begin to consider that an early learning center will come into the equation. So it's, I was surprised that the government did make a shift and did fund quite substantially these services and this new initiative. The other unfortunate aspect, though, is for some reason our government just does not want to see the links between, the governing links between broader policy governance, that is cross-ministry collaboration, despite the fact that health, education, communities, and child protection, and the community service were all involved in this. They all helped to develop this. But that's at the service level. Nothing's happening at the broader governance level. And I think that's unfortunate, again, because WA actually doesn't even have a children's services plan. So there's no big, so there's a real resistance for some reason, and we can't figure it out, there's a real resistance to broad social, the governance framework. How do you link up across the top, not just at service delivery? It needs to be policy and practice. And they're very reluctant to do that. And we have a lot of theories. I won't go into that, but it's just not, it's not happening. So that's something important that's happening. Child Destroy is involved in a place-based integrated service delivery program. It's where Lockridge, our early learning center, is. Lockridge is a low SES area, but it's rich with lots of services and lots of goodwill, good schools, and a lot of health, education, family support services. So we're developing a place-based, so it's not based on the school, but our service tends to be the platform for that. And you do need a platform, as I think you've heard many times here today. You need something where, there's a platform for reaching out and a reciprocal reaching out. Something else that we're involved in WA and the NT is, let me just move down to here. No, I don't want that. I'm not quite sure. Let me just leave it at that for now. I want to talk about collective impact. Has any of you heard of collective impact? You've got, okay, a few of you have. Collective impact is a framework for addressing long-term entrenched social problems. It could be around improving developmental outcomes of children. It could be homelessness, poverty, some of those big thorny issues that are really difficult to deal with. It came, Kramer and Kanya, I'll have the references up here. Kramer and Kanya wrote a paper a few years ago that's on the Stanford Social Innovation Review website. You can go to that website, and there's lots of stuff there. Or FSG, which is another website that's theirs, where they talk about collective impact. It's nothing that, and I do want to find it now. Oh, sorry, that's not. I want to just give you an idea of what it is. It won't be anything that any of you wouldn't intuitively know anyway. Okay, yes, okay, here we go. Collective impact. There's 5 conditions for collective impact. And I began getting interested in this a couple of years ago, but it also has it relate to my background in trying to deal with systems. And I'm always interested in frameworks for achieving broad social impact and change. And so Kramer and Kanya developed this, and really they were looking, and you can see a range of projects around North America and Europe, and now beginning in Australia. And there was things happening on the East Coast, but there's nothing happening in WA and nothing happening in Northern Territory. So we've had forums, and we've started getting some things happening in both of those jurisdictions. And essentially, you start with a common agenda. All participants have a shared vision for change, including a common understanding of the problem. Shared measurement. So you might have 15, 20, 30 different organizations. They all are deciding that this is our outcome. We want the ADI scores and developmental outcomes in this particular population or this particular region to shift by this much within 5 to 10 years. Or we want to reduce homelessness by X percentage in this particular area, and so forth. So it's those large, and they're all organizations that have been working in what they would call isolated impact. So in isolation, getting funded to individually work on those big issues, but individually. So it's about bringing everybody together and sharing, common agenda, then sharing measurement. You've got to, all the data has got to be collected consistently across all participants, remaining aligned, and participants hold each other accountable with that. Mutually reinforcing activities. Participant activities must be differentiated while still being coordinated through a mutually reinforcing plan. It's like staying just close to your partner in that flock. but not too close. Continuous communication. Consistent open communication is needed across the many players to build trust, assure mutual objectives. So, as you know, if you've been working in any kind of collective endeavor or initiative, you've got to constantly be communicating. Now, the last point here is probably the innovation, even though you could probably look at other initiatives in other sectors with this particular component, but it's the backbone support. And that backbone support it's an independent body. So, for example, there's a project starting in WA on homelessness, and United Way is the backbone organization. They're funded, and they've taken the job on to work with about 15 to 17, I think, organizations, all attempting to deal with the homelessness. But it's an independent, and they're responsible for training, they're responsible for the strategic direction, keeping everyone on the same track, for the data and measurement to all be brought together and collated and shared. So that backbone support is an important component in innovation with collective impact. We were having a conversation yesterday, June and Jane and I, about this. And if you can see a whole range of, there's no evidence, by the way, that coordinated, collaborative, not a lot anyway, it's there, you heard from Ted today, there's not a lot of evidence that collaborative, coordinated, integrated service delivery does make a difference, and if it does, what is that difference? We were just having a conversation around this. So if you go and look at one of their programs in Cincinnati, Ohio, called Strive, it's an educational program, they are getting educational results. So by all their indicators, they're getting results from their collective impact initiative. However, the backbone support does not have any authority. So you can have 30 people in the room that come together to make decisions about everything. So if you're a collectivist, and you remember the collective sort of decision-making governing structures in the past, where you had to actually spend hours and days and weeks, deciding on whether to have a table here or a table there, that's one of the frustrating elements of this, and probably something, it's still a work in progress in many of these projects, but by having this, so the backbone support doesn't have any kind of formal authority. They can't just say, okay, this is what the data says, this is what we need everybody to do now. They can't do that. They have to take it back to all the organizations, and everyone has to agree. I think they'll probably find that's going to be problematic in terms of, and they already do. So that's one of the areas that are a bit problematic for them in the changes. But I found this particular, this model and this framework very useful in terms of it's just another one. Is it the best one? Is it the right one? Well, I think we'd agree that there's no best and no right. It's just another framework that actually reinforces multi-agency endeavors and initiatives. So that Strive program is called From Cradle to Career, by the way, in case you're interested in having a look at some of the more recent sort of data and outcomes from collective impact initiatives around the country. It relates in some ways to, I'd like to tell a quick story. I'm just looking at the time, it's about 5 past. I think our taxi's coming pretty soon, so I don't have a lot of time. I do want to tell this story, and you'll be able to derive the connections with your own work, but it's in the domestic violence area where I worked, and it was a very successful initiative in Western Australia that began in almost exactly 1990. And a lot of things, I learned a lot from that. That was really one of my first attempts to actually shift the needle on a big problem, domestic violence or violence to women in particular. And in 1990 in Western Australia, I was asked to be the first manager of a men's program, domestic violence program through Relationships Australia. And I could see right away, it took me 5 minutes to realize this is crazy, starting men's groups, behavior management groups for men in the kind of situation that we had, which was you had women coming into accident emergencies, you had women who were abused on a regular basis, but all you had was women's shelters, women's refuges. Those women had been working for a long time to support victims of domestic violence. And so we were given a very small amount of money to actually start a perpetrator program. And I just realized, I don't know about this. This is not, and I wasn't well liked, I can tell you. They didn't embrace me coming along to do this program. I looked around the world, and I started some men's programs, so they had a 24-week program. But I looked around the world, and I found the Duluth model, Duluth, Minnesota, small town, right on the edge, right up in Minnesota. And why it came from there, I don't know. But it was a criminal justice reform initiative. And you had two sides. You had the women's refuges saying, morally, you cannot provide funding for men. Women need it. And men and counseling groups and the police were saying, but you've got to. It's men who are perpetrating the violence and or it's a relationship issue. So that's where the funding should go. So the two groups, refuges, counseling, and police, were really polarized. And I was in some terrible, meetings where they weren't very nice to each other at all. And so when I looked at this new model that came out of Duluth and decided that I went to the stakeholders, the main people on both sides, and I pitched this, which is why not go for something more than just service delivery? Because they were linked in to program and service delivery. Services for women, services for men. And they felt if it's a zero-sum game. If I lose, you win. If you win, I lose. So that was the tenor of the conversation that was going on. And what I proposed was that you look at social justice reform, criminal justice reform. Why not change the systems and how they respond to domestic violence, respond to women, men, and children in these situations? And through criminal justice reform, by courts and corrections and all the services working together, what you've got then is you'll get your services for victims and you'll get your services for perpetrators, and you'll get a whole lot more. You'll get system change. You'll get policy shifts, and that's exactly what we did do. So they could agree to that. So the lesson there was, don't get stuck in those polarities between either or. It's either if we have this, then you'll have that, and I won't have this. Don't get stuck in those polarities. Step up above, and if you can offer something that's broader, that provides system change, then everybody wins. I think it was Ted that was talking about enlightened self-interest. I just sort of intervened at the level of you're going to get what you want for your particular population. Over a 6-year period, we had action groups around the state, which were little advocacy bodies in groups. We started a pilot project in Armidale, which was an integrated service delivery model. And the police changed their policies to where they intervened. The state government changed its policies, which they didn't really have any policies. We all decided, this is a crime. We're going to treat it that way. And that we're going to work together on this. So today we've got a half a dozen family violence courts. We've got many services for victims and perpetrators. And we were able to actually shift state policy. In a sense, what we had done for 5 years, the state government took on board and created a whole policy department to actually run it from that point on. So we began, in just 6 short years, we went from squabbling over scarce funding to actually working together in really collaborative ways. We also had an education program as well, or a campaign. And it changed, because we moved the dial on community attitudes toward domestic violence. So we moved the dial on all those areas, whether it was community attitudes toward it, or whether it was around policy, or whether it was around practice. And I guess just the learnings there are the same for what we're doing here. It's how do you actually find ways so that everybody gets what they need, and you're reducing the amount of polarities and conflict between if I win, you lose. I think it's 10 past, and I think that's probably, I had something else I was going to talk about, and I'm just not going to have the time to do it, and it doesn't matter, that's all right. I think that I really wanted to say that there's a lot of work going on around the country, Western Australia, and here in every state and territory. Just talking to Sandy a little bit ago, and how she was saying, Sandy Wong, who was talking about, we're doing all this work, but we really need to bring it together. We need to bring the data together and share that at a national level. So I think, the work that is happening here in Doveton and the leadership being shown by June and Brett is a good example for the rest of the country.